Hello and good evening, everyone. I've gotten a few questions from people, and they say, Dr. Wood, I've got my reference list now. What do I do? How do I even attack this beast? How do I figure out what in the world I'm going to be doing next with all this information? I got 15 references. I got nothing. Okay. Let's walk you through the process and see what's actually going to be expected of you and kind of what steps to take going from here. First off, you got to formulate a plan, right? You want to decide how you're going to focus your paper. You've sort of looked at the research now. You've looked through some of those references. Hopefully, you've determined whether or not they're actually going to be useful for your paper. And you need to decide how you're going to focus things, right? Are you trying to make a specific argument? Are you trying to educate providers on a specific topic that maybe they're not very well versed in? What's a certain point you're trying to get across here, right? And try to organize your paper around getting that point across, okay? Always think about what should they be getting out of this, and decide how you can most clearly and concisely try to get that point across for them, or try to make your argument such that the reader is going to get to the same conclusion that you do by the end of it, right? Just like if you're, say, giving a report out on a patient to an attending, and you're trying to draw them to the right conclusion through your differential and through your physical exam and all of that, so that way, by the time you get to it down to your diagnosis, they're like, oh yeah, obviously it's lupus, right? That's kind of the same thing here, right? You're trying to take the readers on a journey to get to the same conclusion that you do at the very end of it, right? Whether they agree with you or not, that's really up for debate and how well you made your point, right? So I want to discuss something I learned about amidst all the controversy around Season 8 of Game of Thrones. If anyone was aware of that, you know what I'm talking about. But the topic of plotters versus pantsers came up, and I think it's important that all of you decide if you're a plotter or if you're a pantser. And you may see, what the heck is that? Are you just making up words? No. Essentially, what the difference is between these two is that plotters are they need to figure out all the details before they really go in and actually do the writing itself. So these are people that need to have a very exact plan. They need to know exactly what points they're going to be making, when they're going to make them. And so very frequently they have a very detailed outline that they're going to start out with. They will have the skeleton of the paper done well before they even start to actually write out the details of what they're doing. So you can kind of think about getting the skeletal structure of the paper first, and then adding meat and organs and all the different stuff until you come up with a fully formed sort of paper there. A lot of the work tends to get done up front, because when you actually do the writing, you already know what you want to say. It's just a matter of actually just hashing it out and writing it, so to speak. On the flip side, then you have your pantsers, and these are people that do better by not really getting bogged down in all the details, but they just start writing, right? They just kind of go, they have kind of flight of thought and say, I'm just going to start writing and just kind of come up with it. They tend to do more work on the back end, because they have to go back through with successive passes and say, okay, well, I wrote, I need to write a 10-page paper. I now have, say, 15 to 20 pages, and I need to start cutting it down. So typically they kind of, more often or not, you kind of think about them molding a vase out of clay or something like that, where basically they have a big hunk of clay, and it's their job to try to shape it into the final form. So oftentimes you're having to cut off a lot of extra stuff. There's a lot of fluff. There's a lot of things that is extraneous that you can cut away to get down to the very bare minimum of exactly what you want to say and getting your point across very concisely, right? Because the point here is not to have a bunch of flowery language so that way you hit your page limit. The point is to make a clear, concise argument and have your argument being well researched and well backed up based off of the literature that you found. I will tell you, I'm a pantser. I tend to just write, and then I kind of go back through and figure out, okay, well, what can I cut away, right? I tend to write a lot of excess details or excess words I don't really need, and then I cut it out, okay? If you're a plotter, there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to figure out which one you are, and that will help to focus how you want to kind of design your plan of attack when actually writing the paper itself. If you still have no idea what I'm talking about, that's probably okay, but you can come by and talk to me if you have any questions, and we can determine if you're a plotter or a pantser. The general flow of the paper, though, so how things typically will go, and this may give you a better idea of kind of where you want to start in terms of writing your paper. Generally, you'll start off with your introduction, and this is mainly going to try to get readers up to speed in terms of where the kind of the baseline level of knowledge they need in order to understand the topic going forward. So for instance, if you were writing a paper about, say, the obesity epidemic, you would start off by saying, okay, well, here are the trends. Here's what we see. Here's the number of Americans who are obese. Here's what has led to this. X, Y, and Z, right? So you're getting a very brief introduction to get people up to speed, and then that way they can be ready when you start to get into the nitty-gritty of the research that you found, okay? The body of the paper itself is where most of your work is going to be. It's where you're actually reviewing the current literature. You're going to be going through each of the pieces and say, okay, well, here's the argument that I want to make, and here's how I'm going to back that up. So, for instance, if you were, say, trying to answer, well, what's the best strategy to treat obesity, you'd say, okay, well, here's where, here's my part of the paper, here's my couple of paragraphs about exercise. What are the best forms of exercise that will keep people motivated and keep them going, blah, blah, blah. And then you might have the next section being about diet, and the next section being about something else. If you remember back in middle school or elementary school, I don't know if you guys are too, you might have had a different curriculum by the time you got into these early grade school years, but I remember making the 3-point paper where basically you'd have an introduction, you'd have 3 points, and then your conclusion. This is kind of the adult version of that, and so there's not a whole lot of difference there. It's a matter of just figuring out what arguments you want to make, what points you want to make, and using the body of your paper to support that, essentially. And this is one thing I've seen with people before is really, really important. You can't just say, well, X is better than Y. You need to say why X is better than Y, right? Go into the details. Well, because of this paper, they found that people who had blah ended up doing this much better than people that did blah. By doing that, you're going to be able to support your argument instead of just saying, well, obviously this is the case. Well, the reader doesn't know that, right? They need to have some sort of research that actually shows that is it the case. So include your numbers, include p-values, include things like that to actually show, that your argument is actually backed up by some sort of data. And then the conclusion is just like you might imagine. It's going to be wrapping up your argument. It's where you're kind of pulling everything together to say, okay, well, basically this is what I think. In conclusion, blah. And by doing that, you're going to kind of get the reader down to that final conclusion that you've come up with. You'll very briefly sort of summarize the argument. And then another point of this that you'll say is going to be, well, what are the strengths and the weaknesses of your research? Now, I'll have a whole other video about this in a couple of weeks. But essentially, you're going to say, like, well, we had really good meta-analyses to talk about why I think that this drug is better than that drug. Or you may say, like, well, it was a bunch of case series. We really couldn't draw a lot of cause and effect sort of analysis from this, but we do think there's a correlation. And that will then lead into, what are your suggestions for future research? Obviously, you could say, well, I'd like a big randomized controlled trial with 10,000 people in each arm. Probably not going to happen, right? You want to think about realistic things that could potentially be done in the future, right? It's not stuff that you're trying to commit yourself to doing. It's just stuff that you think would help to solidify your argument to say, okay, well, this is what I've come up with. This is my best guess based on the literature that's out there. Here's how I think we could probably make a better argument for that. Actually say, yes, this truly is the best way to manage this patient, or whatever kind of argument you're trying to make there. So that's kind of the general flow of the paper. Hopefully this will give you a better idea of how you're going to formulate your plan of attack, how you're going to be going through this. I generally find that writing the introduction is the easiest part because, again, this is where you're going to be citing your textbooks and your maybe some up-to-date articles or guidelines to try to, again, just get the brief introduction, maybe talk about the pathophysiology of the disease you're interested in, whatever the case may be, to get readers up to speed. Obviously the conclusion will be a little bit easier once you've kind of gone through the body of the paper. You've already had very ingrained ideas of how you want to state your argument, the kind of conclusions you've already come up with. The body of the paper, though, that's what's going to take the most work. And again, that's where most of the actual critical evaluation of the literature is going to come into play, which is what you're going to be doing this week. You're going to take one of your pieces of literature, critically evaluate it, given the questions that I'll post along with the assignment, and then submit that. Keep in mind you should be doing that for every paper you're looking at, maybe not as formally, maybe not actually writing it down, but these are things you want to be keying in on. Things like, what are my outcome measures? What kind of patients were they including or excluding from the study, etc. Again, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.